Hey guys, how's it going? My name's John, or EP History, and today I've got another incredibly corny and unedited history video for you guys. However, this hopefully may or may not be part of a larger series. So one thing anyone who knows me will know, or even who don't know me, is I'm a big collector, quite a large military collection, and I thought that I would start making some short videos talking about some of the people represented in my collection. Uh, when it comes to building my own little grouping, I generally focus on items that have a story connected to them. So a uniform that's named, or an item that has a history behind it. And so there is a lot of history to tell in relations to my collection. And I thought, since I've been very heavy on Korea recently, I would start with some of my uniforms that are connected to the Korean War. And to begin with that, I want to talk about this one here, as well as another one which I'll hold up a bit later on, but which belonged to Corporal John Albert Blankley of 3 RAR during the Korean War. And so I'll be talking a little bit about Blankley's story and maybe point out some of the features on this uniform as well as the other one a bit later on. Now, before I get started, I do just want to mention that unlike a lot of people whose uniforms or items I have, Blankley was kind enough to write himself a memoir, A Going Among the Mulberry Trees, an Australian infantryman's story, 1952 to 53 Korea. I will be referring to this heavily, or using this as a resource heavily, since Blankley is a post-World War II service. His service record is not currently available to the public, and therefore I really have his word to go on, as well as a few other newspaper sources and interviews. He has done an interview that I've listened to that tell his story. So if there is any factual inaccuracies, I do apologise. I am researching this as best as I can. But when he wrote this in the early 2000s, so looking back on it with 50, 60 years space between the events and the book, there could be a lot of gaps from lack of memory. If I look down too throughout this talk, I do apologise. I've written down the dot points of that story so I don't forget them. I feel like just give that as a bit of a disclaimer. So John Albert Blankley was born on the 4th of October 1928 in Whanganui, New Zealand. As a young age, he was the oldest of 3 siblings, and at a young age, his parents, while still being alive, ran into quite a bit of financial difficulties and found that they could no longer raise their children. As a result, Blankley and his 2 siblings, his brother and his sister, were put into an orphanage where they would be raised by the church, or the Baptist church. This connection to religion, but also the result of having a very cruel and unfair disciplinarian as a teacher, or sorry, as a caregiver, I guess, would lead to a lot in Blankley's character later on in life, and ultimately play a huge role in his going to the church after the Korean War, which is getting a bit ahead of ourselves. So yeah, growing up, Blankley, like I said, his caretaker, the people who ran the orphanage, they were, according to him, they were quite cruel, they were quite unfair to the children, and they would often take out their anger and their frustrations on the kids, which obviously emotionally scarred a lot of them. When Blankley was old enough, so in 1946, he migrated to Australia, and then in 1947 actually tried to join the Australian Army and was posted at Holsworthy training camp. However, for reasons I have not yet been able to determine, Blankley was court-martialed on the 10th of December 1948 and subsequently discharged from the Australian Army. This must have been somewhat of a bit of a shame for Blankley, since he fails to mention even being in the army prior to 1951 in his memoir. So the records, however, are on the National Archives of Australia, and eventually I will be looking at them to see what he was discharged for. It is unknown what Blankley did between 1948 and 1951, but in 1951 he would volunteer for K-Force for service in Korea on a 2-year army contract, 1 year training, 1 year frontline service. By August, he was posted to Puckapunyal, where he completed basic training and was briefly attached to 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment before being reassigned as a reinforcement to 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. In February 1952, having completed his basic training, he made his way to Japan, initially arriving in the city of Kure, but then being posted to Kawajiri, where the hilly terrain was more suited for training for the upcoming campaign in Korea. Whilst completing his infantry training there, he was a pretty model soldier. There was no complaints, no blemishes on his records. He did have a lot to say about the Canadian major in charge, but that's a story for another time. However, when he completed his preliminary training for Korea, his infantry assault training in Japan, the army was not yet ready to move these troops into Korea, and so it was decided that they would all complete the training again. Before doing this, however, they asked for volunteers to fill specialty positions, and Blankley, not wanting to redo the infantry assault training, put his hand up for signals training. And so while everyone else was climbing the hills and doing mock battles under artillery fire, he was off learning how to use a radio and switchboard. This would again influence his career in the army greatly, as when he arrived in Korea, he would be promptly assigned to his company's signal post. On the 19th of May 1952, his reinforcement unit arrived in the city of Busan, South Korea. They quickly made their way up, and before reaching the front line, they arrived in the town of Daejeon, where Blankley had his first real experience with the devastations of war. Upon disembarking from the train in Daejeon, from a completely rubbled city, stores of young children came running out, and his recollection of it was that they stank. They were pitiful, they smelt terrible, and he couldn't help but feel dreadful for these young children who were coming out and begging for food and begging for water and begging for anything the soldiers would be willing to give, and the Australians were quite happy to give up their day's rations for these children. One stood out in particular, and he was trying to signal to the Australian soldier he was talking to. No one knew what he was trying to say, but eventually it was found out that he was after boot polish. And so all the soldiers, Blankley included, handed over their boot polish and shine brushes to the young child, who then ran off with them, presumably to set up a shoe shine stand somewhere and try and make a bit of money to survive the horrors of the Korean War. Blankley says he has always wondered what became of that child and whether or not he survived the 2 more winters of the war before peace was finally declared. After this, he arrived with 3rd Battalion, RAR, and was subsequently attached to B Company, where he was posted to the signal outpost. In the signal group of B Company, there were 3 members, a corporal and 2 privates, and these guys would take turns doing the various roles of the signalmen, whether this is going out on patrols with radios, fixing telephone lines, delivering messages to and from HQ, blah blah blah. From there, he quickly fell into the routine of patrols, where they would go out at night and set up either ambush patrols or recon patrols in no man's land, and just sit in the dark, essentially waiting to run into the Chinese. 2 instances which stand out from the rest is, number one, on one patrol, all the platoon of about 8 men who were sitting in wait as a standing patrol, waiting to see if the Chinese would show up. They were sitting in the dark well into the morning hours, static, when one of the soldiers let out a tremendous fart. This made all the men in the section snicker to themselves and suddenly start farting themselves before all of them were breaking wind. In what Blankley coined an orchestra of gas. After a few moments of this, the lieutenant in charge of the patrol ordered the men to shut the fuck up, and to which one more solitary fart was released. earning a scold from the lieutenant. Blankley could not help but laugh for quite a bit after the incident, trying to hide his snickering under his breath so the lieutenant wouldn't snap at him. On several patrols, Blankley was teamed up with Lieutenant George Zelensky, a Polish officer who had won the Polish equivalent of the Victoria Cross during the Second World War for his role in Operation Market Garden. Zelensky was known as a truly wild officer within 3RAR. Usually Blankley would not actually be in contact with Zelensky, but sometimes as a signalman he was loaned out to different platoons and different companies. And in this one instance, you had George Zelensky, John Blankley, and two other members of B Company going out on a patrol in a heavy rain. Zelensky decided to lead these three men over the Chinese trench, and since the Chinese had gone into their dugouts, the trench was unoccupied, so they went over and beyond and they started doing some reconnaissance. Blankley and one other gentleman, they sat down in a little dud bomb hole while George went forward with the other, and all of a sudden there was a large splash and a bunch of streaming when the other soldier had fallen into a deep hole and was struggling to swim in the pool of water at the bottom. And all that Blankley could hear echoing in the darkness was George's Eastern European laugh going, ha 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 ha! And that's how he describes it. It's fantastic. At which point, George eventually does help his drowning comrade out of the water, and they come back to Blankley, and still laughing, tries to tell the men what's happening. The three Australians, obviously, they're just concerned about not being heard by the enemy and wish that George would shut the hell up. And so they eventually convince him to start heading back to friendly lines. As they come up on the ridge to the Chinese trenches, George tells them to stop, and he climbs atop the breastwork of the Chinese trenches, and just so he basically gets up and he says, "Oi! George is here!" and then jumps over the trench and runs down the hill. This obviously alerts the Chinese that there's some Australians up there. The three Australians, including Blankley, panic and start running down the hill at full speed with Chinese gunshots echoing from behind them. So this routine of patrolling would continue along pretty much every night while they're on the front line. Eventually, though, 3RAR, specifically B and D Company, were selected for an operation known as Operation Buffalo. On the Chinese line, there was a cave system attached to the frontline trenches in which the Chinese had placed a large artillery piece that was wreaking havoc on the United Nations lines. As a result, B and D Company were selected to lead an assault on the gun and hopefully take it out. On the 13th of August, this assault took place, and they charged forward. It was a bloodbath for the Australians, and B Company suffered quite a few casualties. Only two died, one during the engagement and one afterwards. However, significant amount of men were wounded during the assault, and D Company suffered just as badly. The Chinese trenches were reached briefly, but then the Australians were pushed back. The cannon remained intact, and almost to mock the Australians, they were being shot at by the artillery piece for the rest of the night. As a result of Operation Buffalo, the corporal in charge of the signal section, he lost his brother in the assault. His brother was the one soldier who was killed in the assault. His tour of duty was coming to an end anyway, so they cut it short and sent him back to Japan to mourn the loss of his brother. And as a result, despite not being trained officially as a signalman, Private Blankley was promoted to the rank of corporal and given charge of 3RAR's signal section, 3RAR B Company's signal section. During this time, there's a bit of a gap between 13th of August and the next major engagement. One instance that stood out to Blankley was when a telephone line was cut between the main trench and a forward outpost, and it was his turn to go forward and check it. He was asked whether or not he wanted the flare to go up. Suspecting the Chinese had cut the line in order to ambush him, he said, "No, I don't want any flare." He took with him a kukri knife that he had purchased from a Gurkha soldier that he'd run into, as well as a revolver. And in the darkness, he went out looking for the broken telephone line, kukri in his mouth, pistol in one hand, phone line running in his other hand. Eventually, he did find the break, and incredibly nervous, he repaired it and then sprinted down to the forward outpost to test the phone. He dived into the outpost, was hyperventilating. He was really tense, like he was panicked because he was convinced that the Chinese were there to ambush him. Tested the phone, it worked, and he started making his way back up. Before he did, though, the forward outpost had told him that there were Chinese in the area, and this did nothing to relieve Blankley's anxiety. And so, as he made his way back up, he was very, very anxious. Halfway up the hill, much to his shock and much to his horror, a flare went up. He froze. And because he had specifically asked that there be no flares, they had agreed to that. And the entire no man's land was lit up like a Christmas tree, and Blankley was just standing there frozen, hoping no one could see him. For several seconds, the flare burnt out and finally disappeared, at which point he started to make a bolt for the Australian trenches. As he came up over the trench top, he was faced with the barrel of a Centurion tank, and at the very last possible second dropped to the ground, and the tank discharged, firing a shot over his head into the Chinese trenches. The shot temporarily deafened Blankley, caused him to soil his trousers, as he described it, and actually left him quite shaken for the next 2 months, where he struggled to sleep and had repeated problems with wetting himself as a result of ongoing PTSD, essentially, from this near miss. He got up, he went into the trench, and he started. The British tank commander popped out of the hatch and said, "Oh, blimey, mate, are you okay there?" To which Blankley released some extremely colourful language directed at the poor tank commander, who had actually ordered the flare to go up in order to let Blankley know that there was a round about to be fired. So fast forwarding just a little bit, we go to the 28th of September, which is when probably the most important engagement of Blankley's military career takes place. As usual, a patrol was being planned. However, the chief medical officer of the battalion, Captain John Bradley, wanted to join the patrol as he'd been having a large number of cases of shell shock amongst his men, and he wanted to go on a combat patrol in order to see why so many men were being shaken up by these night patrols. As a result, as you can imagine, battalion was a little bit apprehensive about sending their chief medical officer into the heat of battle, potentially. And so rather than 8 to 10 men patrol, this was really beefed up. In the end, the patrol was led by a captain, Captain John Waterton, which is extremely unusual for just a normal patrol. There was Captain John Bradley, of course. 21 Australian infantrymen were attached, including Corporal Blankley as head signal officer, and also 1 British infantryman who was joining the patrol to learn the ropes of things, since his regiment was soon to take over 3 RAR's position on the front line. As a result, this brings to 24 men in total. These men moved out just after sunset into no man's land, where they reached the destroyed village of Songuk. Here, along the roadway, there was basically a flat road about 10 metres across with 2 drainage ditches either side. On the Australian side, in the drainage ditch, Waterton set up a V-shaped formation along the road flank, facing the Chinese lines, with the intention of creating a lured ambush. Once the V formation was set up, 2 smaller patrols of 3 men each were first one led by Bruce Savilli and the second one led by Corporal Douglas Gately, respectively, moved out. So 3 men that way, 3 men that way, with the intention of engaging and luring Chinese troops back to the ambush point at Songuk. Uh, as they moved out, Blankley settled in comfortably. He knew it'd probably be several hours before these patrols returned, and so he laid on his back, Owen gun across his chest, and waited. And he didn't have to wait long. So at the front of at the very point of the V formation was the Bren gunner, who noticed out of his peripheral vision a number of figures running off to their right flank. He notified Waterton, and the whole formation slowly began to turn, and it became very apparent that between 10 and 20 Chinese infantry were moving across the right flank of the Australian position. As they started rotating their position to face their flank, they noticed more Chinese infantry to their front, and so the V formation turned back to face across the road. Approaching them was a long line of Chinese troops, at least 50 to 75 meters across, with one Chinese officer leading the assault. Blankley describes it almost as like a scene out of a propaganda poster, the heroic officer at the front with his lines of men behind him, and it soon became clear that there was actually a second line behind them again. Waterton quickly realised that even with this initial thing, they were at least outnumbered 2-1. However, they had the element of surprise, so ordered his men to ready along the drainage ditch and wait for his command to fire. The Chinese advanced, and Waterton let them get really close. In fact, the Chinese officer leading reached the edge of the road, climbed up out of the drainage ditch onto the road, stopped, looked each way as if to check for traffic, and then proceeded across the road with the first line of infantry following him. When he was approximately 3 yards away from Waterton, Waterton opened fire with his Owen gun, putting a line of bullets across the Chinese officer's chest, killing him instantly. The rest of the Australians, which there was 18 of, still remaining, began open firing on the forward Chinese line, essentially annihilating that front rank of soldiers. The second rank froze and then quickly pulled back, realizing that they'd been ambushed. However, once they pulled back about 30 meters, they began forming their own line of fire. The Australians continued to return fire, and quickly it was ordered that the radio in that they had engaged. Blankley called in that they had engaged the Chinese, approximately 70 plus troops. As he radioed this, Waterton noticed that the Chinese firing line continued to extend, and he noticed it was getting bigger and bigger, and so he told Blankley to radio in company size plus engaged, which is 120 plus. So Blankley radios this in, and he realizes what's happening, and at this point he actually gets a radio call from one of the other three-man patrols that was now behind the Chinese line of attack, asking what they should do, since they were actually in a key position to ambush the Chinese from behind. However, they were outnumbered significantly. And so what Blankley does, he takes on his own initiative and he tells them, negative, don't engage, return to friendly lines, a special lady will be paying us a visit shortly. And now what Blankley was referring to, that was the code word for the artillery fire which was codenamed Barbara. So when they radioed Barbara, the artillery would unleash on no man's land. And so a special lady will be paying us a visit shortly. So these two patrols said roger that, and they started moving off to the flanks and heading back to friendly lines. At this point, Waterton updated his engagement report. He said, now enemy strength 200 plus. At this time, the first Australian casualty happened when one of the Australians was shot in the shoulder and wounded. Chief Medical Officer Captain Bradley put down his Owen gun and handed out the rest of his ammunition to the remaining soldiers, and instead busied himself providing first aid medical treatment to the wounded soldier. Shortly after, a second man was wounded, and then Bradley took care of his patient. At this point, Waterton realised that they wouldn't be able to hold much longer. The 10 to 20 men on their flank had also returned and were now pushing on the Australians' right flank. And so he ordered grenades thrown and men to withdraw, and Barbara to be called in. So all the Australians pulled the pins on their Mills bombs, launched them at the Chinese, and as soon as they detonated, they began withdrawing up the hill towards friendly trenches. Blankley called in Barbara, and within seconds, the New Zealand battery, the British battery, and the American batteries all began open firing on the Chinese half of no man's land. And it is worth actually a little fun tidbit. Blankley's younger brother was actually currently serving with the New Zealand artillery and was part of the fire mission to support him during the action. As they were moving up the hill, another Australian was wounded, and the non-wounded troops began to carry the wounded back to the friendly lines. Chinese mortars also began to fall onto the Australian troops as they were retreating, but they made it back seemingly without further casualties. It is believed that the Chinese assault was a revenge attack against D Company's new positions for the assault in Operation Buffalo, and like Operation Buffalo, it had ended in a bloodbath for the Chinese. Once back at friendly lines, it quickly became apparent that the British soldier who had joined them was missing in action. This really bit at the Australians, who tried their best to leave no man behind during an operation and couldn't believe that they had allowed themselves to leave the British soldier in no man's land. 3 days later, Blankley was part of a reconnaissance patrol to reconnoiter the battlefield. Surprisingly, they found almost no Chinese dead. They believed the Chinese must have taken their dead and wounded out. But they did find the British soldier who had been killed, and he remains the only United Nations soldier killed in action during the ambush at Songguk. After Songguk, 3 Battalion RAR relocated to Little Gibraltar, or Hill 355, which was the dominating feature overlooking the battlefield in that sector. And they set in for winter quarters. They were issued winter clothing, and they basically dug in. In early January, and I think around January 6th, Blankley was once again selected to go on a patrol. The firing range that they'd usually use to test their weapons was out of order, so they went to a nearby bunker that had been abandoned and were going to take turns firing one full magazine of their Owen guns into the bunker to make sure there were no damages or blockages. Blankley stepped forward, fired his full magazine into the doorway of the bunker, and then cleared his weapon. Usually it was procedure that he had to stand back before the next man steps forward. However, a corporal, potentially Corporal Ron Bowman, however I cannot 100% confirm that, steps forward and begins next to Blankley and begins firing off his own gun. However, halfway through the magazine, the weapon jams. He removes the magazine and, without paying much attention, points the weapon at the ground and tries to remove the bullet in the chamber. However, the bullet doesn't eject, and when he releases the spring, it fires forward and sets off the round, which is perfectly aimed at Blankley's foot. The bullet enters his left foot and causes significant damage upon exit, and Blankley is evacuated to a medical hospital. Whilst in Seoul, in a giant warehouse for evacuating wounded, Blankley is laying on a stretcher when he claims to have witnessed Jesus walking amongst the wounded. This is a key turning point in his life, and he would later credit this vision, if you will, for making him a more religious man and eventually going into the church himself. On the 9th of January, he's evacuated to Japan, and after a couple of months recuperation there, his tour of duty's up anyway, and he's sent back to Australia. He's promptly discharged from the army after another short stint in hospital just to recover his foot a bit more. By the way, he never actually fully recovered. He would go on to say his foot remained stiff for the rest of his life, and later in life would cause quite a bit of pain. In 1955, now out of the army, Blankley joins the Baptist Church as a priest in training. After 1 year at the seminary, despite usually needing 2 years in studies, he is posted to Newcastle as a new priest, and this causes him a lot of grief as he was not ready for the position. He was not used to being a priest, and not ready yet to talk to large crowds and basically bear the brunt of these people's problems. Back then, in the 50s, priests still played a massive role in being sort of an outlet for people's issues and problems. And of course, he had to bear all this on himself. And so after only a couple of years there, he takes a loan from a good friend of his, and he uses the money to study in a university down in Melbourne. After this, he's cleared his head and he's ready to go back to priest work, and he spends a short time actually in Ingleburn, where he is one of the priests of the Baptist church there. In 1968, he actually rejoins the military as a chaplain in the Royal Australian Air Force. And on the side here, I actually have Blankley's Air Force jacket from 1982, and you see he's got his Korean War medals there, as well as a bunch of other service medals. And he remains in that position until 1985, when he again discharges. He basically, after that, Blankley goes down to rural Victoria, and again just runs his church pretty much for the rest of his life, until finally in January 2022, Blankley passes away. And he's nearly 100 years old, actually, late mid-90s. So just a couple of quick things. One thing I actually forgot to mention about the action in Songuk. For their roles in the battle at Songuk, the ambush, Captain Waterton was actually awarded the Military Cross. And if you look on this uniform here, you actually see Blankley was awarded, he's mentioned in dispatches, Oakleaf, for his initiative in managing communications during the ambush. So all in all, this is quite a special uniform, since there were only I may be wrong, there's about 150 mentioned in dispatches in Korea for Army. You can see it's his corporal, custom made Commonwealth Division patch, and RAR shoulder title. And yeah, so that's basically the story behind these two uniforms. Hopefully in the near future, I did not intend for this to go on this long. Just there's more history to tell than I thought. If you like this, give it a like, and in the future I'll maybe do some more uniforms. Lord knows I have enough to talk on forever. Anyway, thank you. If you've listened this far, thank you very much. Hope you have a lovely evening or day, and I'll join you next time.